The late 90s marked a major turning point for the Castlevania series. After many successful titles for the 8 and 16-bit systems, Konami was looking to bring the series to the 6th generation of consoles. Konami allowed not one, but 2 internal studios to develop titles for the 6th gen, and in 1997, Konami's Tokyo studio released Castlevania Symphony of the Night on PlayStation. Oh, and the Sega Saturn. Anyway, in development at roughly the same time as Symphony, Konami's Kobe studio was tasked with bringing the series into 3D for the first time ever, as many other successful franchises, and some not so successful, were also making the leap to 3D. The result of that development was 1999's Devil's Castle Dracula Apocalypse, or if you live in an English-speaking country like I do, Castlevania. Just Castlevania. Yeah, if I didn't know any better, I'd say Konami was attempting to soft reboot the series with this one. The series had been going for well over a decade at this point, and with them bringing it into 3D for the first time, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. The actual overarching story of the game is as beginner-friendly as you can get with the series. Dracula's risen from the dead, and taking control as one of 2 selectable protagonists, whip-swinger Reinhard Schneider and young mage Carrie Fernandez. You need to put him down again before he causes too much chaos. Although there aren't any Belmonts this time, that usually doesn't matter in this series, I guess. There have been plenty of non-Belmont heroes that have squared off with Dracula before, and since, but I digress. If you've played any Castlevania game released before this, with the exception of Symphony, the general structure of the gameplay is very similar. Levels are sectioned off and not part of one big continuous map. While in some cases you are just trying to make it to the end of a level, a few of them here will require you to fulfill certain objectives before you can progress. More on that later. During playthroughs as each character, you'll meet many of the same characters, but Reinhard and Carrie themselves do not run into each other. The game doesn't do the thing like in Sonic Adventure or Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep where the playable characters will run into each other and their storylines intersect. That doesn't happen here. They will, however, meet characters that are exclusive to their own storylines. Really, the biggest shakeup is that Castlevania 64 attempts to take the elements of the side-scrolling, trap-filled game design of the 2D entries before it, and bring them into a fully 3D environment for the first time ever. And yes, one of those elements from the 2D games being immediately dying when falling into a body of water. You can really tell that a lot of the design choices from the classic 2D games, such as traps everywhere, bottomless pits, and general enemy placement, are being echoed in the 3D space that the N64 allows, while at the same time allowing for more open, free-roaming exploration, which comes into play frequently as well. The game even has upgradable main weapons, just like in the 2D games. From just an aesthetic standpoint, I'd say Konami really nailed it. Even after almost 25 years at this point, the Gothic castle interiors and natural landscapes look appropriately striking and spooky. I'd argue it's the game's strongest aspect. It really just goes to show how a good art direction can really bring a video game atmosphere to life. Maybe not so much the character designs, they don't emote at all, like, at all, and they look pretty chunky chunk, but the levels look good for their time and are complemented by a pretty solid soundtrack. Which, yeah, it's a Castlevania soundtrack, that goes without saying. So with this being a 3D game, how does it control? And the answer is... Okay, look, this was still relatively early in the days of 3D gaming. Full analog controls for 3D games were only really getting started, so developers hadn't really perfected it yet. The 360-degree movement works well enough, but I find the characters to be a bit on the slippery side, which can really hamper the pinpoint accuracy you'll sometimes be asked to do with your jumps. In addition to the controls, since this was kind of an early 3D game, the camera's also not the best, since, again, 3D cameras were still pretty new at the time. This and the controls were all just part of the unavoidable growing pains that 3D games... Fuck! This and the controls were all just part of the unavoidable growing pains that 3D games were having around the late 90s. While I was able to get the camera to behave most of the time, it did like to act up on me in enclosed spaces. You get 3 different camera modes that can be swapped between during moments of platforming and enemy encounters, but do expect it to get a little bit out of control at times. You can also do this kind of side jump by pulling sideways on the control stick and jumping, which is supposed to be used when you're locked onto an enemy, but since you don't have to be locked on to use it, I did find myself falling off platforms accidentally because of it sometimes. Oh, and speaking of combat, it's about what you'd expect. Reinhardt uses the traditional series whip, and Carrie specializes in long-range combat with her magical projectile attacks, only now in 3D. It's basic borderline 3D combat with an Ocarina of Time style targeting system, only not as fast or exciting. In fact, you have to wait for Carrie's projectile to either hit the enemy or disappear completely after it misses an enemy in order to attack again. I found that pretty annoying. I do wish you could still move around when you're locked onto an enemy though, like you could do in Ocarina of Time. Unless you do this side jump, which can throw the camera all out of whack, you're locked in place when you target an enemy. I found it way too cumbersome and a bit unpredictable to ever use reliably. You do get 4 of the series' trademark sub-weapons to mix things up though, and you do fight some series regular enemies, and even a few new ones that only appeared in this game. This stained glass enemy is so cool, it's a real shame that no other games have used him since. Oh, this was also the game that had skeletons riding motorcycles and Frankenstein's monster with a chainsaw. Ambitiously, Castlevania 64 also attempts to incorporate an element of realism to the gameplay. By which I mean manually needing to press a button to pick up items or interact with the environment. Hey, I didn't say it was good realism. It was the late 90s, the Tomb Raider games were super big at the time, so Konami was probably inspired by them to include some of that here. A lot of the platforming is quite reminiscent of early Tomb Raider. There's even a prompt similar to that found in early Resident Evil of all things, asking you if you want to pull switches and stuff like that. The game also implements a day-night cycle, which the series hadn't seen since Castlevania 2 on NES. Wow, between this, the shop, and the esoteric puzzles that I'll get into later, this game really does feel like a 3D Simon's Quest at times, doesn't it? Hell, if you take more than a certain amount of in-game time, you'll even get a bad ending. Where the day-night cycle comes into play, in addition to a few optional goodies being held behind gates that are only open during a certain time of day, certain NPCs will only appear during specific times of the day in one level. The Castle Villa close to the halfway point of the game has not 1, but 2 NPCs that can only be interacted with during set times in order to advance the game's plot. This vampire hunter is only awake during the day, and if it's nighttime, you'll have to wait for him to wake up and get out of bed before you can talk to him again. The other example that may halt some players' progression entirely on a first playthrough is this vampire lady that only appears between 3 and 6 a.m. in this one specific room. If she ain't in that room, you gotta wait until at least 3 a.m. She tells you about a key to the castle's archive room, but then after this, you need to go to the vampire hunter, his name's Vincent by the way, to actually get it. And if he's not up yet, you gotta wait until at least 6 a.m. outside of the room that he's in for him to wake up so you can talk to him about it. The game does try to make this easier on the player by including items called sun and moon cards, which will automatically advance the in-game clock to 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. respectively. Using this to get the key from Vincent is easy enough, but with Rosa, you'll still have to do some waiting if it still isn't time for her to show up yet. Between this, the race to finish the game within 16 in-game days to avoid a bad ending, and 1 mandatory door in one of Carrie's exclusive levels, these are the only times the day-night cycle have any real impact on gameplay, that I could find anyway. Oh, what's that? Did I say exclusive levels? Why, yes, I did, thank you for asking. While a grand majority of the game's levels are shared between Reinhardt and Carrie, they do each get 3 levels exclusive to them, which adds some much-needed variety. I won't lie, one of the reasons why this video in particular took so long to come out after I originally announced it was because I knew I was going to be playing many of the same exact levels all over again, just with a different character with a slightly different playstyle. But one level that both characters unfortunately share is the castle center level at about halfway through the game. This is the level with the cracked walls and the explosive item that kills you if you jump or get hit. Okay, show of hands, who all was waiting for me to talk about this level? Yeah, this is the other level that I think may have been a roadblock for players back in the day, and I have no doubt that this level alone made players rage quit the game altogether. It almost did for me, let me tell you. Oh boy, I got a story about this level during my Reinhardt playthrough, let me tell you about that. Okay, so, for the uninitiated. In this level, there are 2 cracked walls. One upstairs in this unassuming hallway, and one downstairs in this very obvious boss arena. You have to carry in your inventory 2 special items, a Mandragora and Magical Nitro, and place them near these cracked walls in order to blow them up. But you can only carry one of them at a time. And when you have the Nitro in your possession, if you jump, land from a fall, or get attacked, the Nitro will instantly blow up and kill you. Oh, and when you die in this game, you have to either restart the whole level from the beginning, resetting all of your progress in that level and making you recollect any level-specific items or weapon power-ups, or reload your last save. So, hopefully you've been saving frequently. And if you were playing this on original hardware back in the day, you hopefully had one of those N64 memory cards. Yeah, so this game does not have an option for an internal battery save or passwords. You need to have shelled out extra money for one of those old school N64 memory cards. Yeah, remember those? The ones that go in the back of the controller? Yeah, full disclosure, I played this on an emulator with save states. I can only imagine how maddening this level would have been if I was playing it legit. Oh, and also, to even unlock the door that the Mandragora is hiding behind, you have to talk to this lizard man in this one room, not attack him. This level contains lizard men that normally would attack you, so you'd think that your only option is to fight it, but not here. It'll avoid all of your attacks, but luckily it won't attack you, so I guess that was supposed to be— Fuck! But luckily it won't attack you, so I guess that is your hint that you're supposed to talk to it. And he gives you the key for the torture chamber downstairs where the Mandragora is. So I noticed that there's a magical seal on the cracked wall downstairs in the boss arena, but I figured I could handle that later. Getting the Nitro downstairs is part of the challenge of this level. Again, don't fall or get hit, but you can at least fight back against enemies. It's also here that I realized that these doors weren't opening. I don't know if this happens at any other point in the game, but the doors in this level will not open until you've defeated a certain number of enemies. You can't just run away from them. The game will not give you that. It doesn't matter how far away they are from the door you're trying to open, you have to fight enough of them before the game allows you to open the door. Which was an absolute pain in the balls, let me tell you. Anyway, ultimately, I make it to the downstairs wall, I blow it up, and then the game tells me that the seal must be removed before the wall can be broken down. So I repeat the process with the upstairs wall, solve the puzzle behind it to remove the seal downstairs, and it's right here during this cutscene that it finally dawned on me. I have to repeat that process of placing the explosive ingredients a 3rd time. Because I tried doing the downstairs wall first instead of the upstairs one, I have to go through that whole arduous process of bringing the Nitro downstairs all over again. I could feel my blood running cold in this very moment. Luckily though, hindsight's 20/20, so during my carry playthrough, I knew to tackle the upstairs wall first, and was able to get through it without any problem. Unless you're following a guide, this first playthrough of this level is probably going to be a pain for you. In fact, for as much as I put off playing my carry playthrough, most of it wasn't as painful as my playthrough with Reinhardt. The puzzles and key locations don't change, possibly to the game's detriment. But I was able to breeze through the clock tower level as carry, where I struggled as Reinhardt, trying to find all the keys to open all the doors, and generally just trying to figure out where to go next. The only major challenge aside from landing precise platform jumps are the boss fights, but since you're so close to the end of the game at that point, it's honestly expected to be a challenge. Actually, speaking of puzzles, the game really only relies on one worth mentioning, and that's the one where you have to undo the magical seal in the castle center. And again, the solution doesn't change, so once you figured it out, you figured it out. Aside from that, the game only really relies on you finding keys to open doors. Heck, when you get right down to it, the explosive walls segment really is just another locked door with a different kind of key. So if you're like actively looking for puzzles, you might be a little disappointed that this game doesn't offer more of them. Castlevania 64 is a bit of an infamous game among the fan base for its quality, but much to my surprise, in 1999 when this game originally came out, it actually reviewed fairly well. It wasn't until a few years later, undoubtedly due to the advances made in 3D games, that people started having a bit more of an unfavorable view of it in retrospect. I can see why, and while I wouldn't necessarily call Castlevania 64 a bad game, it has definitely aged, mainly in the controls and the camera, but the fact that the game's combat is pretty simple and honestly a little on the clunky side. I don't think this is the black sheep of the series or anything, just more of an experiment that might not have paid off all the way. Strangely enough, later in the same year that this came out, Konami released an enhanced version of it. Yeah, this was the pre-DLC days of gaming, so in order to release additional content for a game, they had to release an entirely new cartridge with the same game with extra content on it. I wonder what that would have looked like on the shelves. I mean, did they take the original Castlevania 64 off of shelves to make way for this one? Were they both on the shelves at the same time? If that was the case, then that probably confused a lot of people back then. Anyway, this new version called Castlevania Legacy of Darkness serves as a prequel to the events in Castlevania 64, or at least the storyline of the only character that you have available at the start of the game. You'll notice that Carrie and Reinhardt are playable characters, but you can't select them at first. In order to unlock them, you have to complete certain in-game requirements as another new character, Henry Oldry, and in order to unlock him, you have to beat the game as the game's star character, Cornell. His story, taking place 8 years before the start of Castlevania 64 proper, sees Cornell arriving at Dracula's castle in an effort to rescue his sister, Ada, who had been captured by Dracula's minions. Oh, as a side note, if you've ever played Castlevania Judgment and you notice the wolf guy, yeah, he's actually from this game. So right out of the gate, we get an entirely new level for Cornell. This ship, which is kind of giving me Bloodstained vibes since that game also starts with you on a ship. It's also here where I came to find out that Cornell is slippery. Like, more so than the other two characters from the original game. Seriously, I was falling off of the poles of this ship constantly in this first level. Dude, forget Bloodstained, I was being reminded of Frogger the Great Quest with how often I was slipping off shit. Anyway, I will say one good thing about playing as Cornell, though. His attacks are so much faster than the other two characters from vanilla Castlevania 64. It's no more complex or intricate as them, but it's definitely a lot faster. And honestly, for me anyway, if the combat in your game is going to be basic, making those attacks faster will actually make them more fun to use. Cornell also comes with a special power, and this is the thing that he's most well known for, and it's his ability to transform into a werewolf. You're going to want to make sure you have plenty of red jewels though, because using this power will use all of them up. And there's no way to turn it off once you've activated it, you just have to run out of red jewels. Cornell will go through many of the same levels from the vanilla game as you might expect, though now progression requirements are a bit different. Yes, you'll still need to find specific keys to open doors, but as Cornell, you'll no longer be talking to Vincent or Rosa, and you won't be going into all of the same rooms as Reinhardt or Carrie did. You'll still meet Rena on the shopkeep though, and of course, there are brand new levels made specifically for this game as well. I can commend Konami for wanting to mix things up for Cornell's scenario so it isn't one-to-one the same as the original release. But the overall gameplay, controls, performance of the original remains largely the same here. They're both kinda early 3D titles with gameplay trying to mimic realism, similar to that of the early Tomb Raider games, which made it a bit hard for me to want to continue at times. As evidenced by the fact that I announced this video back in like April and it's now, what, December? January? This one's kinda tough for me. While I will admit I didn't completely hate my time with these games, they aren't ones I'd be racing to ever revisit. Also, I should let you know that while playing this, trying to access the shop crashed my emulator every time. A pretty important part of the game, being able to buy recovery items, crashed my emulator. It's funny that in all of the advances made in Nintendo 64 emulation over the years, it still isn't perfect. And I'm not gonna lie, by the time I got around to this part, I was pretty burned out on playing Castlevania on Nintendo 64, playing 2 other full playthroughs and then Legacy of Darkness almost immediately after, in addition to some real-life stuff that had been happening during the making of this video. This is why the section of the video covering Legacy of Darkness is so short, and I do want to apologize for that. Maybe someday in the future I'll do like a follow-up video that'll go more into detail with it. Hopefully by then they'll have solved the problem as to why this game crashes when trying to access the shop too. They're far from being the worst games ever made, or even the worst in this series, but the consequences of them being such early 3D games didn't do them too many favors. Most people say just play Legacy of Darkness instead of the vanilla game if you're absolutely inclined to play these games. And honestly, I think I'm inclined to agree. You'll be getting so much more bang for your buck that you probably won't be spending because this game never got re-released. Castlevania gave 3D a try, but it wouldn't be for another 4 years before the series would ever try it again. Instead, seeing the success and critical acclaim of Symphony of the Night, Konami decided that the next major game in the series should follow a similar gameplay style. The N64 games would sort of end up being a footnote in the series' history, especially after Koji Igarashi took over as producer of the series and declared them non-canon. Strangely enough, Konami tasked their Kobe studio, who developed the N64 games, to develop a game with gameplay structured more like the 1997 runaway hit, Symphony of the Night, the experimental offshoot that unintentionally ended up eclipsing the 3D titles that I don't doubt were supposed to be the big evolution for the series. That's right, if you didn't already know, the developer would go on to make Circle of the Moon for the GBA, released just 2 years after the N64 titles. And I've already gone over that game, along with its 2 GBA follow-ups on this channel before, so check that video out if you find your interest piqued. As for those other 3D titles that would come after the N64 titles, that's a story for another day. Hey guys, if you made it this far, I want to thank you for checking out this video. I know this one wasn't as long as my other Castlevania videos, and I really didn't go into super deep detail like I usually do with other games in this series. I didn't grow up with Castlevania 64, so I didn't go too crazy with the analysis like I tend to do. This video was more so about my experience with the game almost 25 years later. I also want to apologize for this video taking as long as it did. I started working a new job and then quit one of my other ones and then started working somewhere else on top of that. So I'm currently balancing 2 day jobs right now. Now, I think I might have found a way to carve out some time to dedicate to working on videos now, so hopefully the next few videos won't take more than half a year to come out now. I'm also going to be tackling some games that I'm super passionate about, as well as some ones that I've been curious about for well over a decade or more at this point, so hopefully that'll get me more motivated to get these next few videos out faster in the new year. I've also started a Throne wishlist. I'll link that down below if you want to check that out. And that's about it. Thanks for watching. Please let me know what you thought about this video, share it around if you feel like it, and I'll see you all in the next one.